in Greenland, they're linked to the ocean and their impact on the ocean. And so one of the top priorities identified at that workshop and summarized in the reports shown on the left that you can find on the CLIVR website was the establishment of a long-term glaciological, oceanic, and atmospheric set of measurements. And so essentially, the workshop in December was aimed at moving this forward. I want to point out that while the initial motivation was to understand the impact of ocean on ice sheet changes, in other words, of ocean on Greenland, ice sheet variability, glacier variability, both the focus of GrIOOS as well as of the GrIOOS, maybe too many acronyms with too many G's and R's and O's. Everybody's very confused. But anyways, it's also the impact of the ice sheets on the ocean, including the marine ecosystem. And I think this is important. And so there's this dual role of really studying the ice-ocean boundary that's of interest to both the glaciological and the oceanographic community. So the workshop, the way we organized it is we decided there's a steering committee, which I don't think made it on these slides, but the steering committee decided that we were going to limit the number of attendees to about 50 so that we could have manageable and constructive discussions. And the way in which we selected attendees was to solicit expressions of interest. We did this at a number of meetings. We did this on GrIOOS. And in the end, we selected about 45 participants, meaning science participants from 7 different countries. And it was based on, we wanted to cover a variety of disciplines, oceanography, glaciology. We had climate modelers, we've had ice sheet modelers, we had a marine biologist. We had a strong early career representation, about 1/3, and relevance to the GrIOOS goals. The meeting was attended by Eric Lindstrom from NASA and Will Ambrose from NSF. We also had scientists from Greenland and a government representative from Greenland. We also co-located the meeting, sort of jointly organized it with the Ice Sheet Modeling Intercomparison Project led by Sophie Nowicki and Tony Payne, which was a good way of getting these two communities to interact. So the sort of basic outcomes of the workshop, or what we were trying to get at, what we did get at in some form, is we wanted to define the list of essential variables that needed to be measured. We wanted to come up with a prioritized list of sites. We wanted to discuss integration with existing networks and measurements. We wanted to assess cost and identify international partnerships and discuss shared data policies, quality control, and so on. And the way we structured the workshop is we had several background sessions. We revised the motivation of why we need this. We asked people who had been working on glacier fjord systems in Greenland, about 12 of them, to briefly summarize some of the things that had been learned about these systems, and we covered something like 12 glacier fjord system projects. We spent a lot of time before the meeting as well as the meeting really identifying what measurements are already in place, both in situ, what can be obtained from remote sensing and other sort of mixed projects. And we also had a series on presentations on measurement techniques on the ocean, the ice, the atmosphere, costs and feasibility. And some of the things that we produced are maps. These were done beforehand with a lot of work from Twyla Moon and Dave Sutherland, and I just put this up there to show that we've made an effort to really point on a map what observing systems already exist, both in the ocean. You can see some of the offshore moorings here, Fram Strait, OSNAP, some of the Davis Strait Array, as well as a variety of networks on the ice sheet, all of the atmospheric measurements, VMI station, PROMI station, and then some of the more specific ice measurements. Okay, so then we also had discussion sessions. We broke groups up in three, and we tried to address the questions that would lead to the outcomes before. So what are the essential measurements? What is already in place? How many sites should we be doing? Which sites? Instrumentation, cost, and so on. And we left time for group discussions for a synthesis. So I'm just going to show a couple of pictures. There was a lot of writing on boards, some careful moderation by Bob, stern moderation, I should say, and just a lot of interactions in discussions. And so we're in the process of finalizing the workshop report. A draft of it was submitted as a white paper to the Arctic Observing Summit. But basically, this is just a preliminary compilation, essential measurements, temperature, salinity, pressure in the fjord nearby shelf, bathymetry, ice measurement, discharge, runoff, ice velocity, ice elevation, surface mass balance, melange, calving, atmosphere, local winds, and then regional scale winds. And a lot of these measurements can already be synthesized from existing remote sensing or in situ atmospheric or sort of reanalysis product atmospheric, as can the large-scale ocean. So notable exceptions, which is what GrIOOS will focus on, are the fjord and shelf ocean measurements, fjord atmospheric conditions, and some of the high-resolution glaciological measurements in the frontal region. So then we discussed sites, and one of the things to note is that effectively there is monitoring already happening at a number of sites, both by US PIs, but also by foreign PIs. And so it makes a lot of sense, it made a lot of sense to anything at the workshop to capitalize on these existing time series, which are going to, in many cases, continue regardless of whether they're incorporated in GrIOOS or not. And examples are the measurements at Gotthard's Fjord, which the Greenland government is supporting, ongoing Danish projects and Japanese projects up in northwest Greenland, as well as others. We actually, to try and avoid what the discussion going on forever in sites, we had a voting system which was proposed successfully by a Danish colleague on sites, and this is the ranking of the sites by vote. And you can see that the way it was done is by everybody had 3 stars, and they added stars to the map. So this is it's one way of identifying sites, but again, many of these sites are being monitored by groups already. We discussed instrumentation, and again, it depends, the exact instrumentation for any site will depend on the site specifics. Some of the ideas for the ocean measurements involve moorings as well as bottom-mounted moorings like echo sounders. Some sites, tagged seals have been working well. On the ice, we discussed at least a range of measurements ranging from cameras, seismic measurements for glacial discharge and calving, phase-sensitive radars on some of the ice tanks and on the atmosphere, mostly automated weather stations to supplement some of the existing network measurements. So final report, it's been slow at coming. I take much of the blame, but I think we have it ready, close to ready. And I think what's next is implementation discussions, how to turn some of the existing projects into GrIOOS nodes, how to establish new nodes and which ones. And then there's the part that we ended up not having a whole lot of time for at the meeting is data sharing, data processing, quality control, how to make these uniform across these sites. This is very much necessary given the range of international partners involved. And this is one thing where GrIOOS has submitted a RCN to NSF, which is hopefully moving forward to help create a data portal for Greenland ice ocean. So there's a strong synergy between these activities that would help GrIOOS. And I think that's it. I'm going to end here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Diana. It's very good. I think we'll save discussion until the end of all the presentations. So I think next up on the agenda is Lee. So Jessica, can you give her control of the screen, please? So I think you're on, Lee.
Yeah, I think I'm on, but I don't see where it says share my screen.
Sorry, I was unable to unmute. So Lee, it should be up in the either you have a box right in the middle of your screen that says share screen, or you go to File or Share up in the top left-hand corner.
Okay, there we go. Maybe. Okay, can you guys see my screen now?
We can, thank you.
Great. So I'm going to talk about this meeting that was in Seattle on Arctic Observing Open Science meeting. So this is, honestly, I was one of the meeting organizers, and it probably took me up until the meeting to figure out the intent of the meeting and the structure of Search and AON and what this meeting was about. So for all you early career people there, don't be intimidated by all the acronyms and different structures. Largely, this was a meeting that kind of summarized the current AON projects, and they have these open science meetings. They're supposed to be, I think, every 5 years or so to just kind of generate enthusiasm and trajectories for these observing networks. The last one, I think, was in 2003, so we have missed a few, which is why it might not be on the forefront of our minds about what these meetings are about. So the meeting objectives are on the slide, essentially to discuss the findings of the current projects and operational and technological achievements of the projects, try to figure out how the current observations are meeting the major science goals that have been outlined. So a lot of these projects were initiated 10 years ago, and maybe the science questions that community is driving towards have changed since then, and so trying to reassess what the goals of the observations are. Identify opportunities for collaboration, and strengthen the goals, identity, and activities of the observing system. And so glaciology has been kind of absent from this community for a while, which is why it was not super well attended by our peers. And why it was interesting for me to observe how organized other communities appeared to be around one observing network, but clearly they've been doing this for 10 years already, and so they have a lot of the processes and infrastructure in place, and the collaborations are a lot tighter than what we have, or more formalized, I should say. And so just to add to that, the meeting was really about what we've accomplished and where we should go, where the money should go in the future, I guess, and the focus on science and technological advances, not a gap identification and recommendation process. It's more look at the cool stuff we've been doing, and also trying to cast a broader net of participants and build a broader community. Why can I not advance my, okay. So Mark Fonstock helped me co-chair an Ice Sheets and Glaciers session. Actually, I should give a little bit of the overview of the agenda. There were plenaries on pre-existing AON projects, so that included atmosphere group, permafrost, biology, sea ice, oceanography, community-based observing, and then Mark gave a plenary on, there are a lot of cool things we could do if we had glaciology-focused observing network, which was very well received, I thought. And then there were a lot of agency representatives there, and they had a panel where they discussed, what are the key Arctic science objectives of your agency, what observations does your agency support to help meet these objectives, and how do you envision your agency's role in an interagency Arctic observing network? And so we had representation from NSF, Department of Energy, Office of Naval Research, NASA, Department of the Interior, NOAA, and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And so that was interesting to hear their take on it, and it does seem like this interagency idea is very appealing, but logistically not ready yet. That's kind of the sense I got. And then in our plenary session, so there were breakout groups for terrestrial Arctic, Arctic atmosphere, community-based monitoring, marine ecosystems, sea ice, ocean circulation, human dimensions, observations for global climate models, meeting the needs of managers and decision makers, and then we had a plenary in Ice Sheets and Glaciers, which was very broad based on the people who could actually make the meeting. And so we had a number of talks and then focused our discussion on the need for long-term observing networks in order to understand physical processes, reduce uncertainties, connect our interdisciplinary projects, and link remote sensing and airborne campaigns to a ground-based network. And that we really wanted our observing platforms to focus on the processes and the relationships between ice dynamics and the evolution of subglacial discharge or fjord circulation. It did kind of seem like some of the communities were really focused on the observations themselves, and maybe had been a little bit disconnected to what the, what they're learning from those observations is evolving and what they're learning about the processes. And so we thought we had a nice link to process studies. So we focused our discussion on trying to make our case for having a network and why there are advantages to that. And largely, since these ground-based measurements that we're collecting are pretty scarce, we do see good collaborations and data sharing, but it's very difficult for us to link the observations from different glaciers, time periods, scales, across different disciplines, because each glacier is unique, even over short time periods. And so we really need a network that allows us to do interdisciplinary research productively, and to provide for this direct comparison between processes. And we cannot really do that very well. The scope of our projects in single PI grants does not allow for interdisciplinary observations to the scale that we think are necessary. And what opportunities exist. And so we based on the people who were there, we talked a little bit less about ice-ocean interactions because of the other communities that Fiamma just presented that have really been focused on that. And we thought we could maybe help close this freshwater budget of specific glaciers and looking at kind of the evolution of how, a single water molecule percolates through, the ice sheet, melts, gets to the base, and discharges. And so trying to look at a holistic process more on the ice sheet and then how things enter the ocean, and then maybe tying in with a GrIOOS type project that looks more at the ice-ocean interface. And so, you know, there are clearly a lot of fundamental questions that we need networks to be able to address in an interdisciplinary way. And they can give us specific targets to address processes related to surface mass balance, plume dynamics, and characterization of subglacial discharge and freshwater budgets, and how all of these are linked to ice dynamics. Yeah, I think that is all that I had. So it was, I thought it was an interesting discussion with a different group of people that I'm used to having these discussions about, and so that was nice to see, and that you know, we have been kind of looked over in these large networking projects, but everybody, you know, there was good support for kind of trying to build these networks. That's all I have. I guess I'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, let's wait until Tim is finished, and then we'll see what questions are come up from the whole group. So the last presentation is from Tim Bartholomew, and he represented GrIOOS, which is the one that Fiamma talked about first, at the Arctic Observing Summit, which took place during the Arctic ASSW, Arctic Science Week. I don't know what the other S stands for, which is in Fairbanks just last month. And I guess to the outsiders like me, it's hard to get the sense of the difference between what was going on at Tim's meeting and the one that Lee just described. So hearing about them both together, I think, will be interesting to the group. So Tim, I think you now have control. So Tim, take it away.
Great, thanks, Gordon. Yeah, so like Gordon said, I was at the AOS 2016 meeting that was timed to occur right after the Arctic Science Summit Week back in just almost exactly a month ago. It was hosted by the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and it was a pretty large meeting, about 450 attendees from 30 different countries, and it's about half, the entire Arctic Science Summit Week was on the order of 1,000 attendees, so very broad, scientists identifying and studying a lot of the different factors affecting the Arctic, so oceanography, sea ice, a little bit of glaciology, some permafrost ecology, local community members, also other larger scale funding, but representatives of funding agencies and different organizations, and a lot of sort of Arctic policy folks. And I've taken this block of text here from the official Arctic AOS website, and it's a biennial summit that is organized to provide guidance for the design, implementation, coordination, and operation of an international network of Arctic observing systems. And so this is a community effort organized with kind of a 5 to 10 year history, and like Gordon said, I was there to represent GrISO and GrIOOS and identify opportunities for us to contribute to this larger scale pan-Arctic international effort. So the meeting was structured around a series of different plenaries that gave some background and motivation for why we need to do this work, what's the glaciological foundation for this, what's the marine ecology, community-based observations, and then a little bit of the background of where previous AOSs have, what have they achieved, what are the kind of guiding principles that we had for being here at this AOS. And then in addition to those plenaries, there were 6 different thematically oriented breakout sessions. And I attended exclusively the theme 1, the international and national strategies for sustained support of long-term Arctic observing. So this is very much in line with the goals of GrIOOS, of having these individual sites that are being monitored, where we're making consistent measurements over an extended period of time to better understand how this fjords and glaciers component of the Arctic is changing. Because of the themes were concurrent, there were also I wasn't able to attend, but there were also efforts focused on technology, which was largely centered on drones and the role of drones in future Arctic observing systems, identifying industry partnerships, engaging with a variety of different stakeholders, connecting Arctic observing networks to global observations structures, and then also how to meet the needs of indigenous communities and also incorporate indigenous knowledge into the development of broader Arctic observing systems. Within the sustaining observations theme, there were a number of different presentations by representatives of existing successful long-term operating monitoring networks. And so many of these were pretty similar in the way that they were organized. And by that I mean we have basically groups of PIs coming together to better understand a specific problem. So generally disciplinary focused observing networks say we want to understand circulation in the deep basins of the Arctic Ocean, or we want to better understand the breakup of land-fast sea ice. So different PIs would come together and create a network. And I see that GrISO and GrIOOS are in the early stages right now of following this model, and I think that's probably appropriate, and I think that's the right direction. So I gave a presentation that was very similar to Fiamma's presentation about 15 or 20 minutes ago, and sort of introduced our organization and our efforts and where we want to go to this broader community with an eye towards how can we help these other organizations try and make the right measurements, and how can we perhaps learn from their past and ongoing successes. And so one of the major pieces of this, one of the main messages is to keep a broad funding base. So not, you're not going to maintain a long-term network by submitting the same proposal to Arctic observing networks at NSF every 5 years. No single proposal or organization or agency is going to be able to sustain that. And so it was an impressive variety of different presentations of people successfully stringing together funding from a lot of different organizations. And so I think that was an important message. One of the things that was proposed is that we have an opportunity to perhaps pursue a kind of what was described as a big physics project model. So like the Large Hadron Collider or Hubble. And one of the participants in this theme asked whether or not our work was any less worthy for $1 billion a year than the search for Higgs bosons. And closer to my specific expertise, EarthScope, which is funded by NSF and has a specific geophysics focus, represents an analogous system that basically cost about $200 million over 5 years to get going, and now is funded on the order of about $25 million a year. And so this is a point that had just been proposed and was sort of floated out to the participants within this specific theme, about 50 participants, international in nature and broad in expertise. We didn't really necessarily come to any conclusions as to if we're happy with our existing funding structures and existing project orientation, or if we want to change. But I think that this was a topic that was at least mentioned. And then an important point, specifically within this theme, but then also broadly throughout the entire Arctic Observing Summit, was that the need to include local communities in the planning of these systems from the very earliest stages. So especially when things are in the pre-proposal stage, it's very easy to make additional observations at low cost that really increase the impact and the utility of our science to local stakeholders. And I think this is a nominal additional effort to kind of our existing MO, and really represents an opportunity for us to have broader impacts on a much more, I don't know, a much more significant and much more global stage. So at the end of the meeting, all the different breakout groups came back together and had worked together to coordinate a set of 7 different summit recommendations. And here they are, or here are summaries of them. There's a link here at the bottom of this slide where you can actually read the entire conference statement. But these recommendations are fairly broad, you'll see, and kind of general. So we want to produce international guidelines for research in the Arctic. We want to increase industry buy-in. We want to have multiple different stakeholders with multiple different interests engaged in this process. We want to fund this internationally, largely potentially through the Arctic Council, the group of 8 Arctic countries, and we want to maintain global open data. And so that these recommendations, or very similar to this, was the culmination of this 2.5-day summit. There are still a number of questions that I had. So one of the key points that was made here is that Arctic Observing System, here now I'm changing my acronyms to Arctic Observing System from Arctic Observing Summit, but it was described as a system of systems. And so some of these systems are already running. There are already, like Fiamma also described, there are already observations that are being made and that are useful. And these can contribute to the broader capital letter Arctic Observing System. And so one of the questions that I had, I think that is still extant, is how do we identify what is part of an integrated observing system and perhaps what are not? What are the things that are, what are the key observations that we need to make? And how can we reduce redundancy? So when you have different groups of PIs all pursuing their observing systems that are oriented around their specific discipline, how can we better pool those observations and so that different groups are not making the same measurements just 5 kilometers away from each other? And so I think that that's something that needs to be considered. And one of the conveners and organizers of the Arctic Observing Summit said during one of the plenaries that we know we need an Arctic Observing System, but we don't know what it looks like. And so it sounds like from Lee's presentation, perhaps that kind of question of what does an Arctic Observing System look like, maybe that's something that the Arctic Observing Open Science meeting community is potentially contributing to. So I think that there was a lot of talk about, that the case has been made for the need for an Arctic Observing System, but I think how that is specifically defined is still an open question. Another interesting question I thought was basically how is funding going to work here? And so there isn't even funding for this. There are a lot of different international organizations whose mission is to coordinate and facilitate and provide the rationale for Arctic science and Arctic observations, and they're working to move this effort forward, but they don't have funding themselves. And so I think this was a big push to produce a official Arctic Observing System that may have some kind of dedicated official funding, and I think it for something down the road after this gets developed, there's an opportunity to define how that funding will work. And in general, one of my takeaways is that there's an opportunity to more specifically and more definitively articulate what are the end goals. And so I think Fiamma described how the GrIOOS workshop worked in December, where we had people coming together, arguing for specific observations in specific locations and trying to get concrete. And I think that this was a different kind of meeting than that GrIOOS workshop. This was a meeting from a much, the view from 35,000 feet, where these organizations, these working groups are thinking most broadly about Arctic observing, but it's important to recognize that the Arctic observing summits are not specifically oriented at these kinds of defining and answering specific questions. And so I think there was a lot of general discussion, but I think that the meat of what this will look like still remains to be defined in the years to come. And the organizations that carry this work forward, what are the next steps that are coming out of this? I couldn't necessarily really say, but one of the big organizations that's going to really carry this work forward is this organization, SAON, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks. They are part of, I think, IASC or ISAC, maybe AMAP as well, and are working to try and kind of carry this work forward. And this is something that it looks like it's likely to go to the highest possible levels here, where we carry this work forward and try and work with the ministers of the Arctic Council, a sort of State Department level organization in the US, and to try and pursue funding and to kind of really build this very kind of top-down funding structure to kind of create a official Arctic observing system. So yeah, those are all my slides, and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. That was great. And thanks to Fiamma and Lee also for the presentation.